Imagine a story so ordinary, so painfully mundane that you won't be able to tear your eyes away. A story about a man whose very name, Adolf Hitler, echoes through history, yet whose daily life was filled with the kind of tedium you'd never expect. Before we begin this most delightfully dull journey through Hitler's daily routine, go ahead and tap that like button, subscribe to the channel if you haven't already, and turn on notifications so you never miss a single snooze-inducing episode. I'm curious, where are you watching from tonight? Drop your city in the comments below, hit join the fan band, then find your coziest spot, pull up your blanket, and let your eyelids grow heavy as we dive into the unbelievably boring world of Adolf Hitler. Ready? Let's go. And afterwards, make sure to get into bed quickly and enjoy the rest of your evening. You might imagine that Adolf Hitler spent his mornings poring over battle maps or delivering fiery speeches. But Hitler didn't wake up at dawn. No, Hitler dragged himself from bed around 10 in the morning, groggy and complaining of stomach cramps. Adolf Hitler hated mornings so much that he insisted on a tray of warm water with a single slice of lemon before he would even consider sitting up. Hitler, pale and thin by then, wore the same brown robe he'd had pressed for years, and he shuffled, yes, Adolf Hitler actually shuffled, to the windows to peer at the weather as if it were a matter of great national importance. Once Hitler finally emerged from beneath his covers, he demanded that his personal physician, Dr. Theodor Morell, prepare a concoction of pills. Adolf Hitler swallowed upwards of 20 different tablets before breakfast, everything from laxatives to concoctions derived from animal glands, all in the name of keeping his trembling hands somewhat steady. Hitler's health, or lack thereof, was the subject of endless worry. He carried a handkerchief everywhere, sneezing and wiping his nose as he complained that the world itself was conspiring to make him feel unwell. Adolf Hitler's actual breakfast was perhaps the dullest meal you can imagine. No eggs, no bacon, no steaming coffee. Hitler insisted on chamomile tea, 2 dry slices of plain white bread, and a smear of tasteless jam. Hitler sat alone at a small table, staring at his plate as though it had personally offended him. Then he would launch into yet another monologue, often on the subject of toothpaste, which Hitler was convinced was destroying the very fabric of civilization. Hitler could rant for 45 minutes straight about mint-flavoured toothpaste, all the while refusing to let anyone else utter a single word. After the movie, Adolf Hitler drank yet another cup of tea, this time peppermint, and paced the room while delivering impromptu lectures on everything from bridge engineering to the dangers of modern art. Hitler's speeches could last 4 hours, yet the content rarely changed. Architecture, weather patterns, toothpaste, and why cats were inferior to dogs. Hitler's staff simply nodded along, eyes glazed. Finally, Adolf Hitler would climb into bed around 3 or 4 in the morning, robe tossed aside, robe exchanged for pyjamas he never fully buttoned. He'd pull the blanket up to his chin and, after one last sniffle or sneeze, drift into another restless sleep, only to repeat the exact same routine the next day. And that, dear listener, is the wonderfully boring saga of Adolf Hitler's everyday life. A man whose name conjures images of storm and fury, yet whose ordinary routine was a parade of lukewarm tea, paper-thin jam, endless pills, and repetitive walks. As you let your mind wander through these dull details, remember, the faint hum of mundanity can be more unsettling than any roar of battle. So now, drift off, let your thoughts settle, and when you wake, you'll carry with you the peculiar comfort that even the darkest history has its most mundane moments. Sleep well, and I'll see you in the next wonderfully boring chapter. After Hitler reluctantly cleared his breakfast dishes, always by hand because he feared machine noise, he'd dress. Adolf Hitler's clergy-colour wardrobe at the Berghof was legendary only for its utter sameness. He selected grey trousers and a crisp white shirt every day. Multiple identical sets lined up like soldiers in a row. Hitler's disdain for strong scents meant no cologne, no perfumed soaps. Instead, he bathed daily in unscented soap, brushing his teeth for an agonising 10 minutes despite having fewer than 10 teeth left. Adolf Hitler peered at his reflection, meticulously trimming his signature moustache, convinced that any stray hair was a matter of life and death. By late morning, Adolf Hitler was ready for his daily trek, a limp, predictable stroll down the same winding path through the Alpine woods. Hitler paused at the same knotted oak tree, gazed at the snow-capped peaks, and muttered reminiscences of his youth in Linz. No matter how many times Hitler repeated the same anecdotes, his valet dared not interrupt. Hitler found something comforting in the repetition, as though reliving the same old story would somehow change its ending. Lunch for Adolf Hitler was nearly as bland as breakfast, a simple plate of boiled potatoes with a thin vegetarian gravy, and perhaps an apple stewed until it resembled baby food, because Adolf Hitler's jaw was too weak to handle anything chewier. He ate in silence, save for the soft scratch of his fork, and then drifted off into a brief, unscheduled nap. Hitler insisted on a darkened room, curtains drawn tight, the air silent except for his occasional snores. By mid-afternoon, Adolf Hitler emerged from his nap, feeling only marginally less fatigued. He'd have a second cup of chamomile tea, sometimes accompanied by a slab of plum cake, Hitler's not-so-secret sweet tooth. Hitler could polish off 6 slices in a single sitting, crumbs spilling onto the floor as he muttered about the horrors of sugar addiction in others. He'd prop his feet up on a low stool and study architectural blueprints of the city he wanted to rebuild, Adolf Hitler's grand vision for Linz, with soaring museums and monumental boulevards, all designed to showcase the art he intended to steal. Evening brought Hitler's favourite ritual, a private film screening. Adolf Hitler would settle into a plush chair in the Berghof's intimate cinema room, often to watch old German comedies or, oddly enough, Charlie Chaplin's The Great Dictator. Hitler laughed. Yes, Adolf Hitler actually laughed at Chaplin's imitation of him, though no one could explain why. He laughed so loudly that the entire staff, hidden behind the projection room's sliding door, could hear every guffaw. You're still here? That's wonderful. It means the story of Adolf Hitler's dull, repetitive life is just interesting enough to keep your mind awake, but boring enough to help you drift further into rest. So, let's keep going. Back to Hitler. Now, we already know that Adolf Hitler's mornings were a delicate performance of warm lemon water, identical grey trousers, and chamomile tea. But let's go even deeper. Let's talk about how obsessed Hitler was with silence. Inside the Berghof, Adolf Hitler insisted that doors be closed slowly. Too loud a hinge, too sharp a knock, and Hitler would flinch, sometimes even scold the staff. He believed that noise created instability in the soul, so the entire mansion was kept in a strange, padded quiet. Carpets muffled every step. Curtains were thick enough to block even the wind. And yet, Adolf Hitler himself talked endlessly. Not about war, not even about politics, but about food, about digestion, about his dog's moods, or how he thought people were chewing too loudly in the dining room. One time, Hitler delivered a 2-hour monologue about why German water tasted different from Austrian water. He explained, in painful detail, that it was something to do with mineral content. No one corrected him. No one asked a question. They just listened. Because that was the rule. When Adolf Hitler ate with others, no one else was allowed to begin until he picked up his fork. And when he ate alone, he often asked for the windows to be opened just a crack, because he said, "A breeze makes me think more clearly," but only if the breeze didn't make the curtains flutter too much. That made him anxious. Hitler's afternoon routine wasn't very different from his morning one. In fact, the only difference was the addition of dog watching. Hitler's beloved German Shepherd Blondie was always nearby. She followed him everywhere. And sometimes, when Adolf Hitler was too tired to speak, he would sit in his chair, completely still, and just stare at the dog. Blondie would sit back, also still, also silent. Some say this was the only moment in his day when Adolf Hitler seemed calm. He brushed the dog's fur exactly 32 times each evening. Not 30, not 35, 32. If someone else tried, he would take the brush back. Hitler believed that dogs had a higher moral compass than people, and said that Blondie's eyes were more honest than any human beings he had ever met. He spoke to the dog in whispers, sometimes long speeches about disappointment or betrayal, as if the dog were his therapist. Once, Hitler told Blondie, "You're the only one who doesn't lie to me." But perhaps the most boring and yet revealing detail of Adolf Hitler's daily life was how much he hated being alone and yet avoided people. He surrounded himself with servants, advisors, guards, secretaries, but most of them never spoke in his presence unless he spoke first. He would walk from room to room, the same route, the same slow pace, touching furniture as he passed. Once, he paused for 11 full minutes just to stare at a teacup that had a small crack in the handle. He asked 3 people if the crack had always been there. He asked if it meant the porcelain was low quality. He asked if the cup should be thrown away or kept as a lesson. And then, he told them to investigate the factory it came from. That's the level of obsession Adolf Hitler had. Not with greatness, but with the minute, the ordinary, the absolutely insignificant. In the evenings, after the films, after the peppermint tea, after brushing Blondie's fur exactly 32 times, Adolf Hitler would return to his room. He never read fiction. He said novels clouded the judgment. Instead, he skimmed military history books, mostly ones he'd read before. He liked underlining sentences in red pencil, whole paragraphs, even words he didn't understand, but he never asked what the words meant. He just circled them, as if circling them would force the meaning to appear later. Sometimes, in the deep of night, Hitler would sit at his desk, just looking at a globe, spinning it slowly, not plotting, not marking anything, just spinning, watching continents blur into oceans, and then, when his fingers grew tired, he would whisper, "Enough for today," and turn out the lamp.
Let's now move into the one space Adolf Hitler claimed was sacred, his study. This room was his retreat. Heavy drapes, dark
Let's take a deep breath together and gently, quietly continue. There's still more of Hitler's boring, repetitive, painfully ordinary world to explore. Now, as we settle further into this world of tepid tea and carpeted silence, there's something else you should know about Adolf Hitler. He didn't trust chairs. Yes, chairs. Hitler believed that chairs with arms were secretly bad for posture, and he often insisted on sitting on a specific straight-backed wooden chair. one that squeaked ever so slightly when he leaned. He complained about it constantly, and yet refused to replace it. The chair, like so many things in Hitler's life, was both uncomfortable and unchangeable. That's how Hitler liked it. He had strange rules for everyone around him. At the dinner table, Adolf Hitler made it clear. No one was allowed to cut bread in a noisy way. Slicing too loudly? Unacceptable. He once made a general leave the table because his fork scraped the plate. Even when music was played in the evenings, and yes, there was music, Hitler preferred soft, slow classical pieces. Nothing dramatic, nothing modern, just gentle strings. Sometimes played so faintly that guests had to strain to hear them. And that was the point. Because Adolf Hitler wanted people to lean in, to listen closely, to focus on nothing. In one of the stranger parts of his routine, Adolf Hitler also believed that walking in exact straight lines helped him balance the nerves. So each day, sometime between his nap and tea, he would walk from the eastern corridor of the Berghof to the rear staircase, exactly 62 steps, measured, timed. He would place his foot directly along the tile seams, as if walking a tightrope of invisible order. Once, a maid accidentally left a vase in the hallway, and Hitler stubbed his toe. He didn't yell, he didn't scold. He simply stopped, stared at the vase, and said, "This is how disorder begins," and then didn't speak for the rest of the day. Even his clothing had rituals. Hitler had his socks ironed. Yes, ironed socks. Folded just so. Stored by colour, even though most were identical, and he once spent 20 minutes explaining to a secretary why grey wool blended best with the landscape of thought. No one knew what that meant. No one asked. Because, again, Adolf Hitler wasn't a man who invited questions. Only silence, only obedience, and always the same. Even his writing habits were excruciatingly dull. Adolf Hitler didn't write letters. He dictated them. He would pace the room, muttering phrases, and sit down and say them again, slowly, as a typist transcribed every word. Then he would read them out loud, correct the punctuation, rephrase sentences. Sometimes he'd repeat the same line 4 or 5 times, not because it was important, but because he liked how it sounded in his own voice. "Germany needs silence," he once said, "and I must be its example." As night deepened at the Berghof, and the wind rolled quietly over the mountain pines, Adolf Hitler would return to the same thoughts, the same dog, the same cake, the same walk, the same old books with penciled underlines and broken spines. And though his name became thunder in the mouths of the world, in truth, Adolf Hitler went to sleep each night just like this, grumbling about stomach cramps, adjusting the curtains 3 times, and finally curling into the same side of the bed he had slept on since 1932. He didn't dream, or if he did, he never said. Still with me? If so, you're doing just fine. Take a deep breath and remember, the men who shape history also waste hours worrying about teacups, and that even Adolf Hitler, a man responsible for so much darkness, spent most of his life in the light of quiet lamps, mumbling about sugar.
You're still here. That means the steady rhythm of Adolf Hitler's utterly uneventful life is just boring enough to hold your mind gently and keep your eyelids growing heavier. So now, let's go even deeper into Hitler's routines, those moments so repetitive, so obsessively plain, they almost disappear into silence. By now we know that Adolf Hitler's daily rhythm was built on quiet rituals, but what you may not know is just how much paper played a role in his world. Hitler surrounded himself with paper, stacks of blank sheets, stacks of military reports he never fully read, and hundreds of pages of architectural plans, most of which he traced with his finger, but never changed. He insisted that reports be typed with no smudges, no folded corners, no uneven margins. Once, when a secretary accidentally used a slightly yellowed sheet of paper, Adolf Hitler made her retype the entire 6-page document, not because the information was wrong, but because, as he put it, discoloration is the beginning of decline. This was how Hitler thought. Small details, minuscule patterns, the illusion of control, wrapped in the silence of page edges. And then, there was Eva Braun. She lived at the Berghof with him, but if you're imagining passion or romance, you'll be disappointed.
Adolf Hitler and Eva Braun lived together like quiet strangers. She had her own wing. She sunbathed on the terrace, took photos, clipped fashion magazines. He did not visit her often. Sometimes, at dinner, she'd try to tell a joke. Adolf Hitler wouldn't laugh. He would nod, and then launch into a long explanation of Roman aqueducts, or how a certain city in Hungary was built in defiance of natural terrain. They rarely touched. They never walked together. And when they did sit in the same room, it was usually with Blondie asleep on the carpet between them, the only warm thing in the entire house.
Let's now move into the one space Adolf Hitler claimed was sacred, his study. This room was his retreat. Heavy drapes, dark wood furniture, a single reading lamp, its bulb changed weekly to avoid flickering. On his desk, a fountain pen, a blotter, a globe, and a bronze paperweight shaped like an eagle. He never used the paperweight. It was always slightly off-center, but he never moved it either. He once spent 45 minutes adjusting a pen until it pointed exactly north on the desk. Why? No one asked. Because that was Hitler. He would sit, stare at the wall, and occasionally write notes to himself on tiny pieces of paper. Notes no one ever read. Things like, "Be cautious with garlic. People breathe louder when they're guilty. The dog is unsettled when it rains." And he would fold these notes, place them inside a small silver box, lock the box, and carry the key with him in his shirt pocket. Every night. No one knows what happened to the box, or if he ever opened it again. Now let's drift gently into one of Hitler's final daily routines, his inspection walks. Each evening, usually between 8 and 9 p.m, Adolf Hitler would slowly walk the halls of the Berghof, inspecting light bulbs. Yes, light bulbs. He believed that flickering lights weakened the human spirit, so he had every hallway bulb replaced once a week. But still, he insisted on inspecting them himself, room by room, one by one. He'd stand beneath a lamp, look up, blink twice, then nod and move on. Sometimes, if a bulb hummed too loudly, he'd whisper, "This is how chaos begins," and then mark the door with a chalk X. The staff would change the bulb within the hour, even if it was brand new, because if Hitler couldn't control the war outside, he could at least control the brightness of his ceiling. "You're still here. That's wonderful. You're doing just fine. Let's take a deep breath together and gently, quietly continue." There's still more of Hitler's boring, repetitive, painfully ordinary world to explore. Still with me? That's perfect, because we are now floating through the soft, suffocating stillness of one of the most controlled lives in modern history. Not powerful, not glorious, just oddly repetitive, almost eerily quiet. And that life belonged to Adolf Hitler. Let's keep walking down his hallway of habits. It's late evening now, and Adolf Hitler, as always, is restless. Not energetic, not busy, just agitated. But never for any real reason. Sometimes he'd say his collar felt crooked, or that his fingernails were too short, or that someone had opened a curtain a little too wide and let in unstructured light. Yes, those were his words. Unstructured light. Hitler believed shadows had to fall in a specific way, angled, clean, almost ceremonial. He once made a staff member rehang an entire set of curtains because they were stitched half an inch too short, and the light created a diagonal beam across his reading chair that he called disturbing. He never sat in that chair again. After inspecting his shadows, Adolf Hitler would often sit in silence on a wooden bench outside, just under the balcony. He'd stare into the mountains, not thinking, not planning, just watching. Sometimes for an hour, sometimes more. He never brought a coat, even when it snowed. He believed cold
reminded a man of limits, and so Adolf Hitler would sit, perfectly still, as snowflakes landed on his shoes and melted into the laces. And then there was the mirror. Adolf Hitler had a full-length mirror in his bedroom, and every night, without fail, he would stand in front of it for 10 to 15 minutes. Not grooming, not fixing anything, just staring. From the front, then the side, then back to the front again. He'd frown, tilt his head, check his teeth, run his hand through his thinning hair. Sometimes he muttered to himself, but no one ever knew what he said. Even Eva Braun wasn't allowed in the room during this ritual. He called it alignment. Before the body rests, he once said, it must first face itself. Next, the final preparations for sleep. Adolf Hitler did not like firm pillows. He used a very thin one, folded in half, and placed just under the base of his neck. The sheet had to be tucked tight on all four corners. No wrinkles, no creases, no excess cloth. He would pat the surface of the bed with both hands, exactly 5 times, and then pull the blanket up to his chin, but never over the mouth. He feared breathing recycled air. If a single draft was felt, he would get out of bed, walk to the window, and check the hinges for gaps, even in winter. Then, just before closing his eyes, Adolf Hitler would reach for a notebook, not a diary, not even a journal, just a stack of lined pages with no titles. He would write a single sentence, only one each night. Some sentences were mundane. Had tea, weather stable. Others were stranger. Dog was anxious at 4:17 p.m, the silence before the snow was heavy today. And once, I do not know where my voice goes after I stop speaking. No one read these notes. They were burned in the final days of the war, but this was how Hitler ended each and every night, with a whisper to paper, and then a long, slow, deep breath before drifting off to sleep. And just like that, the day was done. Adolf Hitler, once the storm of Europe, was now a man in a bed, in a room so silent you could hear the fire crackle 3 rooms away. He turned out the light, shifted once, exhaled through his nose, and faded into another night of uneventful rest. Still with me? Then you know that no matter how loud a name echoes in history, even the darkest figures live quiet, forgettable days. And perhaps there's something calming in knowing that. Now take a deep breath. Stay cozy. Doing so well. Still here. Still drifting. As we sink even deeper into the slow, grey quiet of Adolf Hitler's everyday life. A life made not of fireworks, but of routines so numbingly repetitive, they blur into each other like rain on a window. Let's go on. It's morning again. Not the violent morning of history books, but Hitler's kind of morning. A late one. Adolf Hitler never set an alarm. He rose only when his body finally gave in to the brightness of day. Most mornings, that was sometime around 10:30 a.m. Sometimes later. There was no rush, because Adolf Hitler, despite commanding armies, lived in a world without urgency. His bedroom door would open softly. A valet would bring a tray, lukewarm lemon water, exactly 3 slices of dry white bread, and a small square of apricot jam that Hitler never touched. The jam was there for balance, not for taste. Hitler believed in symmetry, on plates, on papers, in schedules. As he sipped his tea, slowly, with both hands, he would stare out the same window, at the same patch of sky, and sometimes mutter things like, "Clouds should move slower," or "Too many birds today." The staff never responded, because that was the rule. And then came his clothes, laid out, always, in the exact same order. Undershirt, pressed shirt, grey trousers, wool socks, slippers before shoes, belt last. If the shirt had even one loose thread, it was discarded for the day. Ironed again, hung again, presented again. Adolf Hitler didn't like surprises. Not in speech, not in food, and definitely not in clothing. He once changed an entire day's meeting schedule because a pair of socks had been rolled too tightly. The rolls, he said, caused circulation anxiety. No one knew what that meant. No one asked. They just rewrote the schedule.
The walk came next. Same path, stone steps, pine shadows, a rusted gate that creaked gently on windy days. Adolf Hitler walked this path with his hands behind his back, always behind, always slow. He wasn't a fast man. Despite the image of fury and rage, Hitler was quiet, contained, sometimes so still that he blended into the trees. Birds wouldn't move when he passed. Even Blondie, the loyal shepherd, rarely barked anymore. She'd walk ahead, stop, wait, and then trot on without looking back. Because she knew the rhythm. Everyone did. By mid-afternoon, Adolf Hitler returned to the Berghof. Lunch was always waiting. Soft potatoes, boiled vegetables, a custard, if his stomach allowed. No garlic, no onions, nothing sharp, crunchy or spicy. Everything was smooth, muted, predictable. He chewed slowly, staring at his own reflection in the silver serving tray. Sometimes he'd pause, mid-chew, and say things like, "I once saw a man eat an apple without thought. That disturbed me." No one laughed, because it wasn't meant to be a joke. Afternoons were for drifting. Not working, just drifting. Hitler would sit by the radio, but rarely turn it on. Instead, he'd listen to the ticking of the wall clock, count the seconds between chimes, sometimes time them with a pencil. If the clock ticked too fast, he'd call a technician, not because the time was wrong, but because he felt the rhythm was too rushed. He didn't trust clocks. He didn't trust phones. He barely trusted chairs. So he sat, on a small wooden stool with no cushion. For balance, he said, for control. And when the sun began to fall across the Alpine hills, Hitler would begin his preparations for evening. Not dinner, not meetings, just evening. He would return to his private study, dust off a small statue of Frederick the Great, touch the top of a globe, spin it once, always counterclockwise. He had names memorized. Rivers, capitals, elevation. He rarely used this knowledge, but he liked the order of knowing it.
Now, let's talk about Adolf Hitler's fears. He had many, but the most boring was perhaps the most telling. Hitler was terrified of furniture being moved without his permission. Yes. Once, a chair was nudged 6 inches to the left by a cleaner. The next morning, Hitler entered the room, stopped, and refused to speak for an hour. He stood there, arms crossed, staring at the chair, as if it had betrayed him. When someone finally asked if everything was all right, he said, "Something is broken now. You cannot feel it, but I can." The chair was returned to its original place. He still wouldn't sit in it. Another strange detail, Adolf Hitler never learned to swim, and he never wanted to. He believed that swimming made people too free, too careless, too relaxed. He once told a journalist, "Drowning is preferable to floating without purpose." That quote was never published, but he said it, and he meant it.
As the years went on, his rituals got slower. His food got softer, his walks got shorter, and the once fiery man who commanded millions became a ghost in his own hallway.
By 1944, Adolf Hitler was often asleep by 3 a.m., his arm curled around a warm water bottle, his notebooks full of half sentences like, "Rain again today. Didn't trust the driver's eyes. Blondie looked through me." And so the nights rolled on, and so did the days, each one duller than the last, not because there was nothing to do, but because he had already decided what each day would be, and then did it, again, and again, and again, until repetition itself became the only thing that made sense. So now we keep going, still slow, still soft, still deeply boring. Until take some time. Let's talk now about Hitler's calendar. You might imagine that the leader of a massive military machine had a calendar packed with appointments. But you be wrong. Adolf Hitler hated calendars. He believed dates were too aggressive. He said they pushed people forward unnaturally, forcing time to behave like a line when it should be a circle. So instead of using a planner or schedule, he used a stack of blank index cards, one for each day. No dates, no headings, just a few scribbled lines. Sometimes they read, "Review map, T, no interruptions, speak to no one before 3 p.m, read report, discard if noisy." He often ignored his own notes, but still wrote them anyway. Until 12. Every Sunday, Adolf Hitler did something that confused even his closest staff. He would spend exactly 25 minutes reorganizing the pencils in his study. They were never unorganized, but he did it anyway. Always arranged in 2 rows, one for hard graphite, one for soft. Sharpened to identical points, erased ends facing left, tips angled 17 degrees downward. No one was allowed to use these pencils, not even for notes. He called them his thinking instruments, but they never touched paper. Until 2012. Now let's move on to meals with guests. Because yes, even Hitler had guests sometimes. But these weren't casual dinners. These were performances. The table had to be set a very specific way. Forks aligned by the centimetre, glasses polished until they disappeared, napkins folded into triangles, never squares. Once, a napkin was folded the wrong way. Adolf Hitler sat down, paused, looked at the triangle, then got up and left. He said nothing. The guests sat in silence for 20 minutes until someone realised the napkin had cost the evening. No one forgot again. And the conversation? It was almost always one-sided. Hitler spoke, others nodded. He liked to talk about how Roman aqueducts represented spiritual superiority, why dogs shouldn't be fed in front of humans, how certain colours could weaken thought. He once spoke for 2 hours about why beige curtains were dangerous, not offensive, not ugly, dangerous. They neutralize the will, he said, and that's the first step to decay. Now, let's return to his walks. By 1943, Hitler's legs had grown stiff, but he still insisted on walking the same path through the Berghof garden each day. He called it the corridor of correction. Always the same time, 4:15 p.m. Always the same route from the east window to the mossy bench under the old fir tree. If it rained, he walked anyway. If it snowed, he walked in silence. No umbrella, no coat, just slow, dragging steps, and sometimes a murmured phrase to himself like, "The mountain listens, even when people don't." No one ever asked what he meant, they just wrote it down, because they thought maybe someday it would make sense. It didn't. And, as the days dragged on, so did Hitler. A man so obsessed with order that he once had his own shoelaces re-waxed because they didn't tie quietly enough. A man who changed tea brands, not for taste, but because the new box had a more obedient rustle. A man who once refused to open a gift because the wrapping paper was too casual. And each of these things, each tiny act, was a thread in the grey fabric of his life. Not grand, not evil in appearance, just boring, painfully, obsessively boring. And still, you're here. And maybe, just maybe, you're learning that behind the myth, the rage, the horror, was a man with creased pyjamas, a chipped water glass, and a favourite stool that he never quite trusted.
So let's return to the quiet, creaking world of Adolf Hitler's private life. The life behind the speeches, behind the war, behind the horror. A life built on shadows, silence, and socks that had to be folded just right. This is post 4, I think is a stream including a first post about the night. The linking goes to full place 48 too, and this data and paunces. Even no, the call in Huss be including. Let's talk now about mirrors, because Adolf Hitler had a particular obsession with them. He didn't avoid mirrors, he stared into them, often for long stretches. He had them placed in nearly every room, not for vanity, but for surveillance. He once said, "People behave better when they see themselves watching." In his private bathroom, the mirror was trimmed in black wood. He had the light bulbs around it replaced twice a week because he believed flickering made his face look untrustworthy. No one dared to disagree. Every evening, before dinner, he would spend 8 minutes in front of the glass, not adjusting anything, not grooming, just looking, hands clasped behind his back, sometimes nodding, sometimes frowning slightly, sometimes whispering things like, "You will not move today." No one ever asked who he was talking to. This same to be moved. In this case, we word losing and forwarded links, together ride with Tories. Now let's look at something truly strange, Hitler's obsession with temperature. He kept the thermostat in the Berghof at exactly 18.5 degrees Celsius, no more, no less. He believed it was the temperature of mental clarity. Too cold and your thoughts retreat, too warm and they melt. Every room was fitted with its own thermometer. If the temperature rose or fell by even 1 degree, he would ring the bell. Not to complain, just to report the discrepancy. "The room has changed," he'd say, "and I haven't given it permission." This night, dinner was served at precisely 7 p.m. Not 6:59, not 7:01. If it was early, he would wait silently, fork in hand, eyes down. If it was late, he would stand, push his chair back, and leave the room entirely. The meal would then be quietly discarded. No one ever asked where he went. Sometimes he just walked the halls, counting his steps, measuring shadows, reciting the names of battlefields under his breath. Not in anger, not in glory, just like a lullaby. And now we reach the final chapter. Not the explosion, not the war, just the last days of Adolf Hitler's painfully boring, tightly controlled, repetitive little world. Connor time. It's April 1945. Berlin is crumbling. The air outside is shaking with artillery, but inside Hitler's bunker, everything is the same. Dim lamps, muted voices, thin soup served at the same time, the calendar still blank, the socks still folded, the water still warm to the correct temperature. Even now, Hitler continues his routines. He paces. He recites old dates under his breath. He opens books he doesn't read. He tests light switches for flickering. The war is lost. Everyone knows it. But no one dares change the pattern, because pattern was all he had left. Connor time. In those final days, he became even quieter. He stopped commenting on weather, stopped correcting people, stopped looking in mirrors. He spent entire afternoons sitting perfectly still in an armchair, staring at the wall. Sometimes he would whisper things to himself. "This is not how I wrote it. The chairs have moved again. The silence is too loud today. Colour time. This is not the silence." Eva Braun was still with him. She tried to play music. He asked her to turn it off. She offered him chocolate. He declined. He said sweetness was a distraction from clarity. Connor time. The meals were smaller, the lights dimmer, the hallway quieter. Even Blondie, once lively, barely moved.
She lay by the door, ears flat, unmoving. And one evening, just days before the end, Hitler asked for a new pencil, not because he needed it, but because the old one had become too familiar. He didn't sharpen it, didn't write with it. He just placed it neatly beside his notebook and stared at it for nearly an hour. Then came the very last night, April 29th. The staff served a final meal. Simple pasta, no sauce, the same water, the same folded napkin. Hitler barely touched it. Instead, he sat with Eva Braun. They spoke quietly. She offered him her hand. He didn't take it. Instead, he stood, walked to his desk, and wrote something small. No grand manifesto, just a few lines. Nobody knows what it said. Because shortly after that, he folded the paper, placed it in a drawer, and closed it softly, as if tucking a child into bed. The following afternoon, April 30th, 1945, Adolf Hitler stepped into a small concrete room beneath the earth. He wore a simple grey jacket, no medals, no ceremony, just silence. And at 3:30 p.m, he ended his life. No speeches, no defiance, no spotlight, just a soft click, and then nothing. The war went on for a few more days, but in that bunker, his bunker, everything stopped. The untouched books, the cold tea, the faded chair, the chipped glass of water, the quiet dog, the silence he had worshipped for decades, all of it, still. Adolf Hitler, once the most shouted name in the world, vanished into the folds of the very boring, very grey, very small life he had built so carefully around himself. And now, you're here. You made it. Through the endless routines, the mirror staring, the paper folding, the breath counting, the identical walks, and the perfectly measured spoonfuls of silence. You've seen the man behind the myth. Not a genius, not a monster, not a mastermind, just a deeply boring man, clutching at control in a world that refused to be controlled. So now, close your eyes if you haven't already. Breathe softly. Let the weight of silence settle around you.